Welcome to Communism in the World, the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation series dedicated to telling the true story of communist ideology, its history of political implementation, and the legacy of Marxist political economy. I'm Murray Bissett, Director of Academic Programs, and I'm pleased to present to you today Dr. Leta Hong Fincher, a scholar, journalist, and seminar associate at Columbia University Weatherhead East Asian Institute, whose most recent book, Betraying Big Brother, The Feminist Awakening in China, was named one of the best books of 2018 by Vanity Fair, Newsweek, Foreign Policy Interrupted, among others. You can follow her work on Twitter at Leta Hong. I can think of no one better suited to teach us today about the subject of our event, the women's rights movement in China. We are truly privileged to have Leta here with us to share her extensive knowledge of this promising development in contemporary communist China. Following her presentation, we will have a discussion with Leta, drawing upon questions submitted by the audience. You can submit questions for her throughout the event using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And with that, Leta, I welcome you, and I invite you to share your presentation with the audience.
Thank you so much, Murray, for inviting me to speak here, and thank you to Victims of Communism for organizing this event. I'm always incredibly heartened when a human rights organization decides to highlight women's rights and gender, because I strongly believe, after the years of research that I've done in China mainly, but also around the world, that women's rights need to be made a much more central feature when we're studying authoritarianism. So I wanted to start by sharing with you, let me just try to do this. Excuse me while I try to figure this out. Can everybody see the screen? I just want to make sure that you can see it. So my most recent book, Betraying Big Brother, The Feminist Awakening in China, revolves around these key 5 feminist activists who were detained in China in 2015. And here's a picture of them. It's Li Maizi, Wu Rongrong, Wang Man, Wei Tingting, and Zheng Churan. And before the detention or the jailing of these 5 feminist activists in 2015, let me just get out of here for a second and return back to you. Or actually, I'm just going to keep going. But before their detention in 2015, really nobody knew who they are. So the women's rights movement in contemporary China was very marginal. Not many people paid attention to them. But it was around this time that the Chinese government began to realize that this very nascent movement of probably only about several hundred young women who were holding acts of performance art around China to raise awareness about women's rights issues, that they were beginning to gather a larger following. And so somebody in the central government decided it would be a good idea to put these 5 young women in jail, and probably thought that by jailing them, that would wipe out the threat of any kind of potential large social movement. And there hasn't really been a large feminist movement in China, I mean, in a very, very long time. And I'm actually going to circle back to the history of feminism in China later. But going back to what these young feminists did, in the years prior to 2015, they were holding these kinds of events like the one on the upper right here, where these young women were drawing attention to the epidemic of domestic violence in China. They were parading down a central part of Beijing wearing these white wedding gowns stained with faux red blood and carrying signs like "Love is no excuse for domestic violence." So that event was held in 2012, and then they were also holding other kinds of events like Occupy Men's Toilets, which was held mainly in southern China and Guangdong province. And that was designed to draw attention to something that was pretty benign, actually, just the fact that there aren't enough toilets for men. And so the central government didn't really pay a lot of attention to them. These women were from time to time called in for some questioning, but nothing really bad ever happened. So it was a real shock on the eve of International Women's Day in 2015 when the Chinese police suddenly carried out a sweeping round of arrests in major cities, in Beijing and Shanghai and Hangzhou and other cities in China, and threw at least 10 feminist activists into detention. And they wound up focusing on 5 young women and bringing all of the 5 women to Beijing and putting them in the same detention center. And it was at that point that their cause suddenly became really big international news. And this was something that clearly the Chinese government didn't count on. So it attracted a lot of global media attention. But inside China, the activist community was also really galvanized. And so what you see on this screen here is just some screenshots of a social media support campaign that was on Weibo and Weixin. So Weibo is China's equivalent of Twitter, and Weixin or WeChat is China's equivalent of WhatsApp. And so each day, this upper left-hand picture here says the first day that the feminist activists, they called them the Feminist 5 Sisters, and then in English they translated it into Feminist 5. So March 7th here was the first official day of detention for these 5 young feminist activists. So supporters of the feminists just took pictures of themselves, and they took this picture wearing the masks showing the faces of the actual 5 feminist activists. And they were very kind of humorous poses outside. So this first picture is modeled on the Beatles' Abbey Road album cover. And the whole idea of the support campaign was to show each day that the young women were detained, that their supporters would post another new picture of 5 young women wearing the masks of the jailed feminists. And they would be in poses outdoors as though the women who were actually in jail were enjoying freedom of movement and enjoying themselves. So this picture below marks the 31st day of detention. And it's kind of, they're posing in front of this public toilet. And that kind of harkens back to their Occupy Men's Toilet campaign, active performance art that they did in 2012. So one hallmark of the young feminist activists performance art campaigns was that they really had a great sense of humor. I mean, they still do. I mean, they're still organizing in different ways, but they thought it came up with very creative ways to draw attention to gender inequality and sexism in China, but they deliberately tried to stay away from politically sensitive topics. So they thought that they were playing it pretty safe and choosing topics that the Chinese government wouldn't be opposed to. And in fact, the Occupy Men's Toilets campaign in 2012 even attracted a lot of official state media attention. And so, and that action led to the Guangdong government actually mandating that there should be more women's toilets relative to men's, because women, needed more stalls. So actually, let me go back to that in a second. So after these 5 feminist activists were jailed for 37 days, there was a really global and internal to China media campaign and to calling for the release of the Feminist Five. And there was the hashtag in English, the hashtag that was created was Free the Five. And really prominent politicians called for their release, including at the time Hillary Clinton, who at the time was considered to be the front runner for US president. And so she called for their release publicly, as well as a lot of other global heads of state. And because of all of this media attention from the outside, pressure from the inside as well, in 2015, I think somebody in the central government decided that it would probably be better to just release the women. And that was in a very unusual step, actually, because things have become much more authoritarian in the last 5 years in China. And so what was very unusual was that the government released these feminist activists after 37 days in jail. And I described their experience in depth, and it was quite harrowing, their time in detention. And even after they were released, they were subjected to a lot of really brutal treatment. But ever since the release of these women, the movement has actually gotten a lot more attention. And what started as a really marginal movement became much broader and spread to all different cities across China, and it's still kind of going today. So I'm going to come back to that. But I wanted to address the bigger context of China today and the nature of authoritarian oppression in China under the new president, Xi Jinping. It's become much more repressive. And I write about what I call patriarchal authoritarianism because I've after a lot of the analysis I've done and interviews, I strongly believe that misogyny underpins the authoritarian oppression from the Chinese Communist Party. And I just wanted to give you some examples of that, the patriarchal nature of the authoritarian control. So as an example, in 2017, this propaganda campaign was started on CCTV, or Chinese Central Television. And they talked about this idea of Xi Jinping's family state under heaven, 家国天下. And it was presenting this image really of a strongman authoritarian ruling over millions of male-dominated families. And this long Xinhua news report, Tsinghua is of course a mouthpiece of the Chinese Communist Party, talked a lot about the importance of family values. And in particular, they had this description of the compound term for nation in China, which is 国家, nation state. But they said Xi Jinping stresses the importance of family values. He says little family, 小家, but he has in mind the big family, 国家. And so these two compound characters, 国 means country or nation in Chinese, and 家means family. And so the Xinhua article goes on to present this notion that all of the little families in China need to be headed by a man and a woman who are married, who have children. And so everybody needs to play their correct role within the little family. And only this way, by having a harmonious family, can you really have a harmonious nation. I should have been looking at the camera the whole time. I apologize for that. But one of the really striking things about the nature of propaganda in China today is that it really harkens back to several centuries ago, the strong Confucian nature of Chinese culture. And there's a primary text, a Confucian text from the Qing dynasty, the biographies of exemplary women, where they have this paragraph: the daughter obeys her parents, the daughter-in-law reverently serves her parents-in-law, the wife assists her husband, the mother guides her sons and daughters. When every family is harmonious, the state is well governed. And it is just so striking how much the current propaganda that you see in contemporary China is really similar. It draws on these very centuries-old Confucian concepts of subservience of the woman in particular, and how everybody has to play their correct role, and the man is the head of the family, and with all of these small male-headed families where everybody's playing their correct role, the wife serves the husband. The mother takes care of the children and takes care of the family itself. Then that is conducive to political stability and a strong nation. So I also wanted to draw your attention to the hyper-masculine nature of the personality cult surrounding Chinese President Xi Jinping. And as an example of this, there have been a lot of pop songs or hip hop songs, efforts to create these kinds of videos or pictures. This one was a song that came out in, I believe, 2016. If you marry a man like Xi Dada. And there were, in Chinese propaganda at the time, there were a lot of references to Xi Jinping as Xi Dada, which roughly translates to Big Daddy Xi. And so the video for this song, you know, if you want to marry a man like Xi Dada, shows these very macho-like images of Xi Jinping, including this one of him, you know, parading down Tiananmen Square and saluting the People's Liberation Army. So one of the things that is really important and was an important harbinger of the kind of ruler that Xi Jinping would become was this speech that Xi gave in 2013. And it was his first major speech after becoming General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. And this part really stood out for me. He said that the Soviet Communist Party had more members than we do, meaning the Chinese Communist Party, but nobody was man enough to stand up and resist. This was a speech that Xi gave in January of 2013, talking at length about why the Soviet Union collapsed, and that the Chinese Communist Party really needed to learn from the failures of the Soviet Communist Party, and only then could the Communist Party survive. So since that time, there's been, of course, China, you know, does not have press freedom, and the state media really dominates all of the news. It's basically propaganda, and those restrictions on Chinese media have become tighter just practically by a month. And so in the depictions of women in these Chinese media reports that you see on television, you know, on the internet, newspapers, magazines, there's very little mention of the importance of working women to China's economic growth. And this is in stark contrast to the way things used to be in the early part of the communist era after the People's Republic was founded in 1949. And so the the emphasis is really much more on women playing, you know, a very docile role in the home while the man goes out to work. So obviously I would say the most horrific example of this patriarchal authoritarianism and the deep misogyny that lies at the heart of China's authoritarian oppression is what is happening to Uyghur, Kazakh, and other women in Xinjiang right now. And actually, victims of communism, that your senior fellow Adrian Zenz did a really superb, really influential study that came out recently documenting a very large-scale mass campaign of deliberate sterilization, insertion of IUDs, and even abortion carried out by the Chinese state against Uyghur and Kazakh women. And as a result of that deliberate campaign to curb reproduction among these women, the birth rates have just dramatically been slashed over the last couple of years. It's really horrifying. And so, before I go on here, what I want to emphasize though is that these kinds of, I mean, even before the Chinese government began carrying out this this effort to really, I mean, it really is a form of genocide and ethnic cleansing, according to the UN definition of genocide. But years before that, there was already this effort to try to curb reproduction among Uyghur and Kazakh and other Muslim women. And just to give you some examples, and this is something that I actually wrote about in my book, Betraying Big Brother, which came out in 2018 before we knew about this, before it was documented that there was this deliberate campaign of mass sterilization of women. But as an example, you know, Global Times in August of 2017 warned about worryingly high birth rates and rapid population growth in Xinjiang. And in 2017, that was the real policy turning point for Xinjiang, when officials there used quote unquote ethnic equality as their justification to end a decades-long policy that allowed Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities to have one child more than Han Chinese families. And a Xinjiang official in 2015, going back even earlier, warned also in Chinese state media that high birth rates in southern Xinjiang negatively affect quote unquote population quality in the region, posing risks to social stability. And so, so now what we're seeing in Xinjiang with these mass detention camps, and then there, you know, I'm not going to go into that in much greater depth because so many other people have done a lot of thorough research. I just wanted to show this picture of one woman who I've interviewed quite a lot, Zumrat Dawood, who herself escaped from Xinjiang. She's Uyghur and she has 3 children. She wanted to have a 4th, but then she had no idea what was going to happen to it. She was taken to a hospital, and then she basically was forcibly sterilized and had no idea that she was going to undergo that procedure. So she was able to escape China, and there are quite a lot of other Uyghur and Kazakh women who have escaped and are telling stories about what happened to them. So that's really important because it shows you how the Chinese government views women overall as reproductive tools of the state. And it also shows you the central critical importance of eugenics in the Chinese government's population engineering goals. So just to give you some examples of what their propaganda is for the majority Han Chinese population. The government is targeting the educated Han Chinese women, who are the vast majority of women in China, or I should say Han Chinese women are the vast majority. But this propaganda campaign that started, well, I mean, it's been going on for a long time, actually. I wrote about it in my first book, Leftover Women, in 2014. But at the end of 2015, the Chinese government abolished its draconian so-called one-child policy and introduced a two-child policy. And it also introduced a new propaganda campaign trying to get college-educated Han Chinese women to, first of all, to marry and then to have more babies. And so here's an example. This was a long feature piece that appeared in the People's Daily in December of 2015. And it had the headline, "Female University Students with Babies, Brighter Job Prospects, Student Moms on the Rise." And this was actually the photograph that they used to accompany this very long piece of propaganda. It's this blacked out image of just a figure, you don't even see her face, just carrying the baby who's in color. But you can see from this mortarboard on her head that she has graduated from college. And so she's educated. Some other images, this was from People's Daily Online in 2017. It had the heading, "You'd better believe it, under 30 are women's best years for getting pregnant." And the whole article was trying to urge college students who are young women to actually marry and have babies while they're still in college. And it has this line, "Female university students, joyful love, freshman year live together, sophomore year get pregnant, junior year have baby." And you have these pictures of very all made up, very conventionally attractive Han Chinese women kind of gathered around a baby stroller. And this woman on the right, not only, so she's graduating and she's holding one toddler in her right hand, and with her left, she's resting her left hand on a very visibly pregnant belly. And so it's through this kind of propaganda that the Chinese government was hoping that this new two-child policy would actually result in a huge baby boom. And there were all sorts of rosy predictions in the state media about that. But that has not come to pass. There has not been a baby boom at all. And in fact, it's been the opposite. That birth rates have been plummeting. And by the way, so have marriage rates. And so in spite of these newly pro-natalist policies coming from the Chinese government, particularly college-educated Chinese women are just not falling for it. Here's an example of just something that is being pushed by the All China Women's Federation, which is, this was from 2018. These are courses to, quote unquote, raise the quality of young women, teaching them good posture, grooming, and makeup of traditional culture. So these are all efforts to push these young Han college-educated women into extremely traditional, subservient roles of wife and mother in the home. So going back to, I want to wrap up here, going back to the feminist movement, I see 2015 as a huge turning point, really, for the women's rights movement in China, because it became so much better known after the jailing of the Feminist Five. And in 2018, the most influential feminist media platform, Feminist Voices, was banned on Weibo and WeChat. And this colorful picture here shows you the spirit of the feminist movement. They're This was after their feminist voices had been banned. And this banner that they're holding says 女权不死, which means feminism will not die. And it shows you, you know, it's almost like a celebration, and it really shows you the spirit of these young feminist activists, that they continue after each setback that they encounter, they continue to find ways, you know, to keep their movement alive, to find joy in the struggle. And I should add that the founder of Feminist Voices, Lu Pin, has now moved, ever since 2015, she's been self-exiled in the US. So I want to make sure we have enough room for questions, but I wanted to quickly come back to Chinese history and show you this image of the legend of the Jingwei bird. This is from a really remarkable feminist work that was written by the feminist revolutionary Qiu Jin just a little over 100 years ago in 1905. And I'm just going to read a bit from my book, actually. So Qiu Jin left her husband and 2 children behind in China to study and give political speeches to Chinese students in Tokyo. And that's where she wrote much of Stones of the Jingwei Bird. As one version of the Chinese legend of Jingwei has it, the youngest daughter of fiery Emperor Yan Di was named Nuwa, meaning little girl. Nuwa longed to see the sun rise over the ocean, so she rowed in a boat out to the East Sea at dawn. As she was rowing, the cruel East Sea whipped up a heavy storm that capsized her boat and drowned her. At the moment of her death, Nuwa transformed into a magnificent bird with a white beak and large red claws, screaming out, Jingwei, Jingwei, in anger and pain. Jingwei, the soul of Nuwa, named after the sound of her anguished screams, sought revenge by picking up stones in her claws from the mountain where she used to live, flying back and dropping them into the sea each day to fill it up. The East Sea mocked Jingwei and told her to abandon her pitiful effort. You silly little bird, how could you ever dream of filling me up with those stupid stones? But she vowed never to give up. Jingwei would persist every day for thousands of years, no matter how long it took, until she succeeded in filling the sea. Qiu Jin used the myth of Jingwei as a metaphor for the struggle of Chinese women fighting for their freedom and their country. With all my heart, I beseech and beg my 200 million female compatriots to assume their responsibility as citizens. Arise, arise, Chinese women arise, she wrote. Chinese women will throw off their shackles and stand up with passion. They will all become heroines. They will ascend the stage of the new world where the heavens have mandated that they reconsolidate the nation. Qiu Jin herself was beheaded at the age of 31 before she could finish writing Stones of the Jingwei Bird. But her life and work have a lot of parallels with the resistance of young feminists in China today, who are so often ridiculed as inconsequential little girls. And the legend of Jingwei has given rise to the Chinese aphorism, Jingwei Tianhai, Jingwei fills the sea, meaning perseverance in carrying out an enormous task against seemingly impossible odds. So there are so many parallels between the beginnings of an incredibly powerful feminist movement in China at the turn of the century and this new feminist movement that has arisen in recent years. Let me stop there so I can take some questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Leta. That was just absolutely wonderful. I mean, you just spanned more than hundreds of years and just a ton of topics, and yet still provided, you know, so much detail for us to kind of grasp onto this. I know that we have some questions already rolling in from our attendees, so I do want to remind the remainder of the attendees that they can give their questions for Leta using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And just to start off, because I do know that we have many educators here with us, I always like to ask, what general advice you have for them in teaching about the women's movement in China, both historically and contemporary, its contemporary manifestation. And then related to that, which primary resources do you think are essential for middle school or high school students to really be able to grasp the importance, the continuities, the discontinuities, that sort of thing?
I mean, I find I don't teach middle and high school students, but I do teach undergraduates and master's degree students. But I would especially imagine that with younger students and even with university students, they tend to think a lot about their own lives, and so there are a lot. If you can bring parallels with what is happening with activists in America as well, that's a way for them to really relate to what's happening with these young activists in China, because they're really young. I mean, the activists who were jailed in 2015, their age ranged from, mid 20s to the oldest was in her early 30s. And so, but the other feminist activists who are kind of at the core of the movement are even younger than that. And there are actually high school students as well who are feminist activists. And so, so it's kind of, I think it's pedagogically helpful to sort of bring up parallels with the U.S. and activism in the U.S. today. I mean, as far as primary sources, I mean, I'm assuming that they don't read Chinese, but of course I would, hope that they read my books, Betraying Big Brother, and my first book in 2014, Leftover Women, The Resurgence of Gender Inequality in China. I mean, there are so many other books about, I think, very readable books about women in contemporary China. One of the classics, I think, is Factory Girls by Leslie Chang. And there, I mean, gosh, I can't remember but Xin Ran, the author Xin Ran, has written quite a lot of really very readable books about women in China. So, if I think there are too many to actually recommend. I mean, for older students, it's a little bit difficult to read, but one that I teach in my courses for university students is the translations of another feminist revolutionary, He Yin-zhen. And this was a new volume that was published in 2013, and it's called The Birth of Chinese Feminism. And these are just incredibly brilliant, dizzyingly visionary essays that were translated into English for the first time in this volume. And that's by Columbia University Press. But those are just some suggestions.
Wonderful, thank you. How does the Me Too movement here in America support China's Me Too movement? Or, has there been much, mutual support, solidarity, exchange in terms of tactics? And then more broadly, of course, Me Too in the West, became a focus of Western media. Has Western media really covered the movement in China? And what about Chinese media?
Yeah, well, that's a really important topic. And I actually write about that quite a lot in my book, Betraying Big Brother. And in fact, it was towards the end of my writing that the Me Too movement really burst on the scene in China. So in the US, it kind of started around the end of 2017. And it took a while. It didn't immediately catch on in China. But of course, remember that there is no press freedom or internet freedom in China. And so, and of course, that's by design. so that the Chinese government can just, blast its propaganda and limit the free flow of information coming from the outside. But the Me Too movement obviously went viral globally. And there are a lot of young Chinese women who are either studying or working abroad, including the US, Europe, Canada, Australia, all over the place. And so that diaspora of young Chinese women who self-identify as feminists, those young women have been really critical to kind of kickstarting a Me Too movement, or the equivalent of one, in China. And it really burst onto the scene in the beginning of 2018 in China. And it just was, there were several different graduates of Chinese universities who went public with their own stories of being sexually harassed by their professors, or raped or sexually assaulted, and it kind of snowballed from there. And what is particularly extraordinary about that in China is that the obstacles to any kind of movement like that are so much greater in China, because you know what, I actually had a little picture of it in my PowerPoint that I'll just describe it because it's too hard for me to call that up. So one of the ways, these feminist activists, who the most radical of them, who are really organizing all the time and finding ways to get their message out, to get around the internet censors and get the message out on Weibo, China's equivalent of Twitter, or Weixin, the equivalent of WhatsApp. So they're always playing this cat and mouse game with the internet censors. And one of the most highly reported on strategies that they used was to come up with emojis for the Chinese words "me too," which means rice and bunny rabbit, as a substitution for "me too," because it sounds like "me too," it's "me too." So they used the emojis, and that did get around the internet censors for a while. And so they were able to circulate these, Me Too stories about sexual harassment or sexual assault and evade censorship for a while. But as with anything in China, the censors always catch on after a while. But the feminist activists have been really ingenious at finding different ways to get around the censorship. But there's no question that the intense censorship is just the first barrier, really. It's not reported on in the Chinese media. Actually, I take that back. It has begun to be reported on in the Chinese state media because it is so widespread. And this is something that is really astounding. And this is one of the unique features of the feminist movement in China, because, as an observer of China, I see this feminist movement as really being the most vibrant and resilient and widespread social movement that I have seen in China since the massive pro-democracy uprising of 1989, that of course was crushed in the Tiananmen massacre. But this feminist movement now is very different, of course. China is much more authoritarian and repressive now. However, it does have, in spite of the censorship, it does have a very sophisticated intranet behind the Great Firewall. And so there are these little cracks in the internet censorship. And in those little cracks and those gray spaces, there is still a little bit of space for activism. And it just never ceases to amaze me how, the China's version of the Me Too movement can keep getting jump started again, and through different, largely women, or just ordinary women, or not just women either. It's mainly women, but it also really affects the LGBTQ community non-binary people, and also men, young men who who are allies of the feminists. And so there is definitely a potent version of the Me Too movement in China. And one of the unusual things about that movement is that it is particularly active on university campuses. And in one indication that the Chinese government sees the Me Too movement as a potentially very dangerous threat to social stability is that you often find that there's a young woman. It tends to be a woman, but there are also men who are victims of sexual violence. But it tends to be a young woman, a student on campus, and she'll come forward about with an accusation about a professor or somebody in the university administration. And in a place like the US, these cases take years and years and years and drag out. But in China, the Communist Party is so afraid of it getting out of hand that you often see universities immediately firing the person who's being accused of the harassment, because they just think, who needs that person? Let's just fire them. So that definitely, if nothing else, is an indication that the Communist Party does see the threat posed by this kind of feminist movement and does not want it to get out of control.
Thank you. So going back to the subject of your first book, the Leftover Women campaign, in the years since you've published it, have you seen a change in how they have, conducted that campaign at all, or has it intensified? Has its focus shifted?
Sure. Well, leftover women, or 剩女, was a term. The term is still widely used, but I did a lot of research on this when I was doing my Ph.D. in China at Tsinghua University. And at the time, so I discovered that the term started being really aggressively propagated by the Chinese government in 2007. And I believe that it was a deliberate propaganda campaign to shame single college-educated women who were in their mid-20s, to shame them for being single and to push them into getting married, to warn them that if they delayed marriage too long, that they would become just useless, undesirable women, leftover women that no man would ever want to marry. And so the message was, hurry up, you women, don't continue your educations, don't further your careers. Your top priority has to be to get married. Now, that goal is the same. In fact, I would argue that that goal has intensified. So first, the women need to get married, and marriage, heterosexual marriage, because same-sex marriage is banned in China. So heterosexual marriage is seen as very conducive to social stability, but the government is facing this perceived demographic crisis of plummeting birth rates and a severely aging population. And so at the end of 2015, when China got rid of its so-called one-child policy and introduced the two-child policy, it started coming out with this new kind of propaganda. So that leftover women, the term, the propaganda revolving around that term had basically played itself out. And then they were trying to come up with new effective forms of propaganda that went beyond the marriage stage. So you had all these mass matchmaking initiatives. In fact, those are still going on, and they're run by the Communist Youth League, believe it or not. So you have marriage as an essential first step, but then the real goal is to get these college-educated women to have babies, to have 2 babies. And going back to what is happening with, the ethnic cleansing in Xinjiang, is it shows you that the Chinese government is worried about plummeting birth rates, but it is also obsessed with eugenics and engineering the right kind of population. So on the one hand, you have plummeting birth rates. This is Han Chinese women are choosing not to marry and have more children. But then you have Uyghur and Kazakh and other Muslim women who actually do want to have, in many cases, a lot of babies. And traditionally, they did have a lot of babies. But now they're being forced to, there are so many horrifying stories of the mass sterilization and forced IUDs and abortions. And so it depends on what kind of woman you are. So it's all part of, so the Leftover Women campaign was all part of the same effort, which was get these so-called high quality Han Chinese women to hurry up and marry and have a baby, and now have 2 babies. And now the effort is, the propaganda efforts and policy initiatives, I might add, are focused much more on getting those women to have babies.
Thank you. In light of the rising authoritarianism that we've seen in China, where do you see the feminist movement, developing? And do you think that it's a movement that could gain more ground and secure more liberty than the religious movements in China? And our attendee, asks, because the CCP needs women essentially to cooperate in order to perpetuate the Chinese race. And currently, I mean, as you've told us, all their efforts are producing the wrong result.
Yes. Yeah. So I have to say, when I finished writing this book, it was the fall of 2018. So it's a little, basically 2 years ago. I honestly was not sure how long this feminist movement could survive. And I wanted to document it because I thought it was just incredible. There were so many things that were fascinating about it, that these young women who are involved are deeply inspiring, and that their movement and the women, the brave women at the center of the story, needed to have the stories told. But I mean, I really have just been astounded by the resilience of the movement and how widespread it has become. I mean, and I believe that one of the reasons, if not the key reason, that the movement has been able to endure is precisely because, first of all, it's so widespread. I mean, these feminist activists are talking about things that resonate with literally millions and millions of women all across China, which is, by the way, why the Me Too movement, has gone viral around the world too, because these are the same kinds of issues that women around the world are grappling with, and so women in China, or young women in particular, especially those who've gone to college, are undergoing this awakening where they're really waking up to the deep level of sexism around them, and the unfairness that they feel, the gender discrimination, when they're at university, the sexual harassment, the sexual violence. Then when they graduate from university, it's incredibly difficult for them to find jobs. There is, really blatant gender discrimination in hiring, in spite of the fact that these, for example, it's actually illegal in China to specify that a company only wants to hire a man, but in spite of that, there are so many companies that still do that. They specify they're only hiring a man, and even if they don't advertise that, you know, it's incredibly difficult for these young women to find jobs. And the female labor force participation has really been plummeting as well over the last 20 years. But one of the reasons why the Chinese government hasn't just decided to jail all of the feminist activists, I mean, it still is a fear. It still definitely could happen. I mean, so many horrible things have been happening in China. It's very grim overall. But what you haven't seen yet is a massive roundup of feminist activists, throwing them all in jail. And I believe thus far that the reason is the government needs to co-opt these Han Chinese college-educated women. It's trying to entice them. You know, it's trying to say, listen, you should marry, you should have your baby, and then you'll be rewarded. So the middle class is growing exponentially in China. And so I think that if there were to be a mass jailing of feminist activists, and if the government tried to crush the movement, just as it has crushed so many other social movements, that there would be an enormous backlash. And it's not the same as the situation that you see there are so many different examples you could give. For example, Hong Kong, you know, or the situation in Xinjiang or Tibet, because, you know, we're talking about a movement for the rights of all women in China, or at least all Han Chinese women. So this is why the Chinese government has actually responded. It's being forced to respond to some of the specific demands of the feminist activists. For example, those 5 feminists who were jailed in 2015, they were jailed just because they were handing out, in fact, they didn't even hand them out, they were planning to hand out stickers about sexual harassment on subways and buses. To commemorate International Women's Day. And just for planning that activity, they were thrown into jail. But today, you actually see in the large Chinese cities, you see government ads warning of sexual harassment on subways. And so that is exactly what the feminist activists wanted in 2015. They were jailed for it, but then the government goes around later, responds, and actually adopts the demand of the activists. And you could have a lot of examples with the Me Too movement as well. The Ministry of Education in China has actually now been developing nationwide regulations mandating that universities have to have a plan to prevent and address sexual harassment on university campuses. And I mean, they're in the middle of working it out. Domestic violence is another topic that I didn't even touch on. But it does show you that the government has to take these complaints of half of its population seriously. And that's one of the ways in which the women's rights movement is really different from other social movements that have come before.
Thank you. We're coming up to the very end, but I do want to ask this last question from an audience member. So some Chinese feminists who identify as neo-left feminists disapprove of movements such as the Feminist Five, contending that they adopt a Western liberal form of feminism. What do you think about this? And what do you think about the 2 differing schools of feminism in China? Are there only 2? Are there more? We'd be interested in your view.
Well, there are so many different kinds of feminism in China, and I think that it just goes to show you how widespread these beliefs are, that there is a lot of arguing inside China among people who count themselves as feminist activists about, you know, the best strategies, the best causes to take up, you know, what is truly feminist, what is not, what is fake feminist. I mean, it's like any other social movement. There are always divisions within social movements. And to me, I mean, I think it's this multiplicity of voices within, you know, movement participants or leaders that I think it's very common. I was going to say healthy, but you know, I don't think anything is healthy in China at the moment because of the incredibly grim, repressive overall political environment that is very, very hostile to any kind of social movement. And I think that perhaps that hostile environment maybe intensifies some of the arguing, but I mean, if you look at the civil rights movement or the feminist movement in the US, I mean, there are all sorts of factions and there's no uniform voice. There's no one person who represents the entire cause. And so I think that that's just the way social movements are. To me, what is really striking is that you have so many different voices that acknowledge that, you know, women's rights really need to be taken seriously, and that there needs to be a social movement that is feminist or that is promoting the rights of women and the LGBTQ community and non-binary people and all kinds of marginalized people.
Well, thank you, Leta, not only for joining us, but for your ongoing work to educate us about these, you know, brave women that are there fighting for freedom today in China. It is very inspiring. I want to remind our audience that you can follow Leta's work on Twitter at Leta Hong. I want to thank you all for attending today's program, and I ask that you please join us again for our next scheduled event in the Communism in the World series, which will take place on Monday, November 30th at 4 p.m. Eastern, where we will mark the Memorial Day for the Holodomor with a webinar on the Holodomor. We will be joined by Dr. Alexander Model, a professor of political science at Rutgers University, Newark, and specialist on Ukraine, Russia, and the Soviet Union, who also happens to be the editor of the Holodomor Reader, an invaluable resource for teachers teaching about the Holodomor, the genocidal famine in Ukraine. You can find more information about that event and our other upcoming events, our curricular resources, our Witness Project episodes, and our other professional development opportunities for teachers at victimsofcommunism.org. You can follow our work on Facebook and Twitter at VO Communism. For the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, I'm Murray Bissett. Thank you all for attending, and have a great day.